My name's Nick Deming. I'm a special agent with the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. I wanted a job that wasn't routine. Law enforcement's not a routine job.
The state only hires the best people because they are looking for the best people. Deming's been a detective for 10 years and is now working for the SBI out of Jacksonville, North Carolina. I met Nick Deming. He's a great guy and he is sharp. He knows his business.
That day, I was with my coworker. I get a call about 9 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, it's Deming.
There was body parts located in a burned barn in Columbus County, about 2 hours away. We drop everything and head their way.
Deming gets a call about this grisly scene over in Columbus County. Dismembered body parts set on fire? This is not your average assignment.
When I arrived at the scene, I remember it was still smoldering.
The sickly, sweet odor of burned flesh. The stench is a hard, hard thing to deal with.
You treat everything really as a death investigation. You don't form the opinion of suicide, homicide right out the gate. But here in this particular case, I certainly want to treat it like a homicide.
Their arms and legs were scattered around throughout the debris.
Whoa, guys, down.
Once we moved a piece of wall, we found the second torso.
Hey, detective, you're gonna want to see this.
It took it to a different level.
Wait a minute. Now we have two victims. Dismemberment is an incredibly evil thing to do. To kill is not enough. You are so filled with hate, you want to destroy the identity of this individual. Even animals don't kill like that. Animals kill to survive. They don't do so because they enjoy it. Only humans do that.
At this point, I don't know if the victims were murdered here or dumped here.
Agent Deming is faced with a question. Did this crime occur here, or is it just dump the remains, set them on fire, and run away? Odds are very good this is a dump site, not a murder site. To control two living people and get them in this building is not an easy thing to do. But it's very easy if they're already dead and already dismembered.
When we arrived at the scene of the barn, we had nothing. No victim identification, and certainly no suspect.
When you arrive at a scene that's been destroyed by fire, it's frustrating because you're already behind the 8-ball and the investigation has not even begun. There's no evidence for you to find. It's already been destroyed.
We stayed on scene with investigators throughout the night and assisted with removing the body remains.
Who are these people? Where did they come from? Are they related, or are they two separate murders? We need to figure out what happened.
We're just here to ask you a couple questions about the house fire.
To get some answers to those thousands of questions we have,
Did you happen to see anything?
we start knocking on doors. We start trying to get a timeline of when the fire was started.
Were you home around 5:30 p.m. yesterday?
Deming tries for a canvas in this area, but there's hardly anyone that lives here. The person that saw the flames and called it in was merely a passerby. There are no surveillance cameras. This is rural North Carolina. Mother Nature is the only witness to this.
When I was at the crime scene, I overheard that 2 females were missing out of Wilmington. I was thinking that was a good distance away from where we were at in Columbus County, but it's definitely something that we wanted to follow up with.
Sunday, April 2nd, 2017, in Wilmington, North Carolina. Reverend Blevins is greeting his Sunday morning parishioners.
Eva Jo Jones and Tiffany Cartwright were there every single Sunday. On this particular Sunday, we noticed that they were not there. That for them was very unusual. On Monday morning, I had gotten a text message asking me if I had heard from Eva and Tiffany over the weekend.
We really need to check on them. We then said, well, let's just drive over to the apartment.
They find the place locked up. Eva and her daughter Tiffany have never missed a church service in years. Everything about this is alarming to them.
We went to the manager. We asked him if we could go in with him. And so he opened the door. It smelled very clean, like some type of disinfectant. We went all the way down the hall. Everything was absolutely spotless. Everything was put in perfect order. There was not a dish in the sink. There was nothing. Like they had just packed their bags and left. I just knew something wasn't right. So I called the Wilmington Police Department and reported them missing.
Wilmington PD responds to the apartment, finds the place neat and tidy. Everything here had the appearance of total normalcy. Nothing to see here, folks. And yet something here just isn't right. Where are these people? Why did they tell anybody where they were going?
So I realized that we have 2 ladies missing out of Wilmington, and we have potentially 2 human remains that were found in a barn. Due to the fire damage, our best hope was to reach out to the Wilmington PD and get the dental records to identify the human remains.
The coroner's office determines that the bodies discovered in the barn are, in fact, Tiffany Cartwright and her mother, Eva Jones. When you see a case like this where the violence is extreme, it's personal. This is not some random act by a lunatic. This perpetrator is intent on covering his tracks. Demi knows this, but no one can be careful enough to stop a good detective. Agent Demi now knows the identity of these 2 unfortunate souls who were discovered dismembered and burned to a crisp. No one in their hometown of Wilmington knows that yet. As far as they know, these women are still missing.
Prayer after prayer, going up tonight for Eva Jones and her daughter, Tiffany Cartwright. No one's heard from the mother and daughter since Friday. Both missed Saturday doctor appointments and Sunday service at Life Community Church. Their car gone, their phones going straight to voicemail. Now their church, that's more like family, just wants them found.
Wilmington PD is now aware of who these people are and report to Harriet at their church, the woman who reported them missing in the first place.
When I heard the bodies were dismembered, I don't think I have ever felt so sick and so... It was just an awful feeling.
Here we are in an investigation where a mother and her daughter are found brutally murdered, dismembered, and set on fire. Who would want to do them harm? Someone certainly did.
At that point, we don't know too much about them because we were kind of almost working two separate investigations until we hit that overlap. But Wilmington PD had spoken to friends from the church, people in the community.
I met Eva and Tiffany pretty soon after they came to the church. They were there every single Sunday.
Eva is 60 years old and is employed in a legal office in Wilmington. Her daughter Tiffany is 35 and is a custodian at a local elementary school. They live together in an apartment.
I did get to know both of them. Eva, particularly, she just had such a sweet spirit about her. And Tiffany, she was great. She was quieter. She served in our ministries. They both were amazing people.
Law enforcement always talks to the next of kin to figure out who else might be involved in this story. Wilmington PD told me that they had spoken to Eva Jo Jones's other daughter, Sarah.
Sarah has now moved out of state after separating from her husband and now lives in Ohio.
On that Thursday during the day, Sarah made her trek from Ohio in her car to Wilmington, and she came straight to the church.
Wilmington PD met Sarah at the church and informed her that her mother and her sister were deceased.
To the police's credit, they didn't want her to be alone at that moment. And so we met at our church, and they shared the tragic news with her. And it was a moment. I hope I never have to sit in a moment like that again.
Watching a human being absorb that kind of news, it was traumatic to me. I can't imagine how traumatic it was for Sarah. Just what do you do with all that pain? Where do you put all of that?
Sarah is, of course, devastated by this news. They inquire of Sarah who might want to do them harm.
Any issues with anybody?
Sarah says no one. They're the nicest people in the world. The usual story. No one has threatened them in any way, nor are there any difficulties with anyone.
I knew, based off the dismembered bodies, that this is going to be some linked to a crime of passion. It's going to be linked to a potential anger, sadness, all sorts of emotions that just built up.
Affairs of the heart produce emotions like nothing else. People get really distressed when they believe they're being rejected. This produces rage, and rage becomes revenge, and revenge becomes murder. Who are they romantically involved with? How did that come to an end? Did somebody monkey with somebody else's monkey? That's always a problem. Eva is 60 years old, but she is single. They asked, does she date people? And they say, no, not recently. Okay, what about her daughter, Tiffany? Well, she has an ex-boyfriend. They broke up. Oh, really? Their friends know him as Ben Chapman. They dated for a period of time, and now they don't anymore. No one knows much more about them than that. But it's a name, and it gives Deming a place to go.
Thank you for meeting with us.
Who are you, Ben? And what do you have to do with this, if anything?
And I've seen it in my training and had experienced that a lot of times it's a breakup with a girlfriend. Could be that thing that triggers that person to take a life.
Deming is considering how to approach Ben and identifying where he's currently located. when he's contacted by the coroner's office with the results of the autopsy.
The medical examiner's report came out, and the findings were horrific. You got blunt force trauma, dismembered bodies, removal of the limbs, and decapitation. This is some dark stuff.
What's the cause of death? Well, take your pick. There's probably 20 causes of death in there. These people weren't just dismembered, they were tortured. The hate that this person feels never dissipates during this entire process. He's having the time of his life killing these people.
A lot of times a straw that breaks the camel's back could be learning of infidelity, somebody leaving, a partner, betrayal could play a big factor in there.
Ben is an ex-boyfriend. How did he become an ex-boyfriend? A transgression by him or a transgression by Tiffany? Police like ex-boyfriends. They do stupid things. I've seen death by every means except a nuclear weapon. Is this the worst murder I know about? It's certainly in the top 10. I've had worse, but not many. In this case, we're talking about the dismemberment of 2 women and set on fire. Could it be that Tiffany's ex-boyfriend, Ben Chapman, be the person who did that? He's certainly worthy of further inquiry. They find nothing about him to be suspicious in any way. All his friends and associates say that he is a wonderful person.
In a lot of cases, the ex-boyfriend or girlfriend can be a great source of information, but in this case, it wasn't a help.
When you're looking for someone that has this level of violence in them, you assume that they have an extensive criminal record. Ben Chapman doesn't have one. His demeanor does not match someone who is capable of doing what was done to these 2 women. Ben Chapman didn't do this. Someone else did. At this point, we're spinning our wheels somewhat. They haven't even established the location of the crime scene yet. They know where body parts were dumped, but that's not where these murders took place.
We always want to find the scene of the crime. That way we can locate more evidence. That way we can help determine through that evidence who was there, maybe even who wasn't there.
So the scene is still out there, and Deming knows it. Where is it? It's likely it's their apartment. Despite what the police say they observed when they were in there. So let's go back and look again.
Detectives go back to the apartment to see if anything's there that they might have missed. They locate Eva's purse and phone.
Now that's interesting. Just one victim's phone was discovered in their apartment, Eva's. But where is Tiffany's? Deming needs to figure that out, and fast.
Cell phone records are great because the cell phone provider will give us the location of where the cell phone was last used.
So while they wait for answers from the cell phone company, the investigators carry out a full forensic workup of the victim's apartment. There's a factor involved in physical evidence of a violent crime. It's called blood. Blood has a habit of showing up in the darndest places, even after time.
Crime scene investigators are highly trained individuals. They got more chemicals, they have these fancy lights, they have all sorts of equipment that can help them develop leads and collect evidence at a crime scene a normal cop couldn't gather.
Blood is a curious thing. It's a viscous liquid. It's not like water. It's thick. And eventually it's going to seep back to the surface. On this occasion, they see something they didn't see 3 days ago. Now they see a faded crimson stain on the carpet. They block all the windows. They hose the place down with luminol. And it lights up. There is blood everywhere. Blood in the bathtub, blood in the bathroom. Blood in the carpet.
Finding this amount of blood tells us that somebody could have been killed in this apartment. Today's technology with DNA, if there's a large loss of blood, it's going to be extremely hard to get rid of it all. So you're trying to figure out what else isn't here that should be here. There was hacksaw marks on the bathtub, and that could have played a role in how the bodies were dismembered. There was a brand new shower curtain placed in the bathroom, which by itself isn't necessarily anything, but when you start combining all these other factors, it's pretty significant. At this point in the investigation, with no signs of forced entry, it's somebody that had access that they willingly let into the house.
So now we're getting somewhere at last. Deming now needs Tiffany's cell phone records back, because they're the next piece of this puzzle.
Great, thanks.
Location data can tell you a great deal about a cell phone. In the case of Eva Jones, the last location ping on her phone was on the doorknob in her apartment. She didn't go anywhere. In the case of her daughter, Tiffany, when they get those results back, it's a total mystery.
We learned through investigation at Wilmington PD that Tiffany's last ping was in Myrtle Beach.
So what is Tiffany's phone doing in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina? We need to go back to the victim's relatives and friends to find out what connection, if any, they had to that location.
We knew that Sarah, Eva's other daughter, had lived in the Myrtle Beach, South Carolina area.
So Wilmington police talked to Sarah to figure out who else might be involved in this story.
We were married for about 2 years.
One of the persons she mentioned was her estranged husband, Jeffrey.
Sarah, the surviving daughter, is going through a divorce with her husband, with whom she had 2 kids. The husband's name is Jeffrey Harmon.
Got divorced recently.
Sarah has left Jeffrey and is currently living in Ohio.
Wanted to stay together, be a family. I didn't.
She says Jeffrey is hoping they'll get back together, but she has no plans to reconcile with him.
Everybody who's in Eva and Tiffany's sphere of influence is in Wilmington except for one, Jeffrey Harmon, who lived in Myrtle Beach.
Well, Jeffrey, that's a bit of a problem now, isn't it? Tiffany's phone is pinging in your city. There's a moment in every case when something happens that is the key to something. You feel a sense of calmness come over you because the tension has left you. This is it. This is what we need. The last cell phone location ping on Tiffany's phone was in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Now who lives in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina? Well, Jeffrey Harmon does. The estranged husband of Tiffany's sister, Sarah. Sarah says Jeffrey says he loves her and wants her to return to the family home. He seems to get along fine with his mother-in-law and his sister-in-law.
Jeffrey was a even-keel man who volunteered with the Boy Scouts and was known to be relatively quiet.
All right. All right, thank you.
We weren't able to locate anything significant between them through domestic violence or anything of that nature.
Following the murders, the investigators had reached out to Jeffrey to tell him what had happened to his in-laws.
Wilmington spoke to Jeffrey Harmon. He said he hadn't seen Tiffany or Eva since Christmas and he had no plans to see them.
When Wilmington PD spoke to Jeffrey Harmon, he told them his mother-in-law and sister-in-law did not want to be involved in their marital problems.
When police talked to Sarah, she gave them the same story.
So that account is all confirmed. But surprise, surprise, it's not the entire story because it never is. Harriet Blevins, the wife of the minister, recalled something important.
I knew about Sarah and her husband's troubles because Eva would confide in me and others at the church to pray for Sarah. She was always very concerned for Sarah and for her children. And that she did not think that Jeff Harmon was a good guy. And she did not think he was good to Sarah. I think that Tiffany also was not happy that her sister was married to such a man.
Let's run him through the system. Find out where he lives. Well, Jeffrey, Tiffany's phone is pinging close to where you reside.
It started to click, and we at that point knew that one of the phones was down there at his residence. And it was a bold-faced lie if he said he didn't see him since Christmas.
I always loved it when people lied to me. Tell me a lie. Because if you'll lie to me, I'm talking to the right fellow. Now we have to go confront Mr. Harmon, go see him, and look him in the eye.
I'm Sergeant Jamie Jernigan. I formerly worked with the Ord County Police Department as an investigative detective in the homicide unit. April 4th, 2017, the criminal investigation unit receives the call from Wilmington PD to send out a detective to an address out on Leo Drive in Myrtle Beach. The detective attempts to make contact by knocking on the door. He checked the windows, he looked around, he didn't see anyone.
So where's Jeffrey? Is he hiding? Is he just at work? Interesting.
So he took his business card, put it in the door.
They left a business card for a reason. They want Harmon to know they were there. They want to see if it hinks him up at all.
I was at home asleep after working a long day, and I'd hear the phone ring around 2 a.m. The 2 a.m. phone call is never good. It's Horry County Police Department.
Deming is on the phone with the Horry County Police Department in South Carolina. They reported they received a phone call from Jeffrey Harmon's friend.
We knew we had a problem.
The Horry County Police Department in South Carolina received a call from Jeffrey's friend, who was in Jeffrey's home. He said Jeffrey called him in a panic, so he headed over to the house. He went inside. As he approached the bathroom door, he heard a gunshot.
I arrived on scene and was immediately met by initial responding officers.
Jeffrey apparently realized the police were closing in. He did not want to face them.
There was a male subject who was found deceased in the bathtub, fully clothed, from what appeared to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. With the evidence that was collected at the scene, we were able to conclude that there was no foul play, that it was in fact a suicide.
So he takes the coward's way out. He eats his gun. Now they have to obtain all the corroborating evidence, so the investigation continues.
We found the victim's jewelry in the neighbor's trash can, and victim's cell phones, multiple handguns, multiple boxes of ammunition, a notebook that was recovered that actually did contain a suicide note. And we took Jeffrey Harmon's pickup truck from the location. I believe it was a Dodge truck.
Detectives now have a good idea on how this crime took place. They don't have a perfect idea because they weren't there. The evidence would show that Sarah leaves Jeffrey, and he doesn't take that well.
Sarah told me that the relationship with her and Jeffrey was very strained. She described it as miserable, but that there was never any violence or any addiction to drugs or anything like that, just that it was an unhealthy, difficult relationship that she was looking to get out of.
Sarah left her husband, Jeffrey Harmon. Jeffrey Harmon decided it's best for vengeance to lash out at her loved ones.
Jeffrey Harmon has a psychopathic episode and decides he will torture his wife by butchering her mother and her sister. What his motivation for that is, who knows? I'm not crazy, so I don't know.
March 31st, he purchased some duct tape. Buying duct tape just sounds like there was some forethought and planning to what he was about to do. He drives his truck to the women's Wilmington apartment.
This again. I don't want you here.
Eva Jones doesn't know what his intention is that day.
We don't want anything more.
I just want to talk.
As there's no signs of forced entry,
I just want to talk.
Okay, come
It's believed that Eva Jo Jones let Jeffrey Harmon into their home.
Detectives believe she lets him into her apartment, and he attacks and kills her. Drags her into the bathroom, into the bathtub, and chops her up, for God's sake. He can't get enough blood on him. That's how psychotic he is at this particular moment. He is out of contact with reality. Detectives believe Jeffrey then waits for the daughter Tiffany to come home. They find photos in Jeffrey's phone of Tiffany tied up and duct taped and kidnapped for a period of time.
Harmon kidnaps Tiffany and drives her back 200 miles to his residence in Myrtle Beach.
Eventually, he kills Tiffany as well and dismembers her.
Tiffany and Eva were missing for 3 days. Evidence is still unsure where Tiffany was killed or where her mother's remains were held during this time. But what we know, he takes the remains to an abandoned barn and sets the barn on fire.
He then proceeds to try to cover up what he's done. Clean up the apartment, vacuum the blood out of the entry hall. All the different tricks that he thinks will absolve him of guilt in this matter. He returns home. He thinks he has a plan. It comes unraveled when detectives close in. When panic sets in, your worst enemy is your mind. He can't face that. He's a tough guy when he's faced with two small women he can overcome. But he's not truly a tough guy. He's just a nutcase. So now he chooses self-destruction over punishment.
He called a friend. Jeffrey locked himself in the bathroom and laid in the bathtub and shot himself in the head.
So long, Jeffrey. The world's a better place without people like you.
Investigation has shown he acted alone in doing this. In this case, case closed by death of offender.
You can't prosecute a dead guy, so the case is closed. Without question, this is sick. Jeffrey Harmon is one sick little boy.
Six years later, we are still grappling with the fact that something like that could happen here within our community and, our family, basically. It's just astounding. I think if I could talk to the kids or to Sarah today, that I would just really reiterate to them how much Eva and Tiffany love Sarah and those kids.
I would say that this is one of the worst I've worked. I learned some lessons from this case. Don't overlook anybody just because they're not wearing all black and a ski mask. They could easily be the guy next to you in the store. Jeffrey was known as an even-keeled Boy Scout leader, mild-mannered guy, and he was our guy.
Sarah met the wrong guy. And Eva Jones and Tiffany Cartwright died in the worst possible way as a result. Good police work nailed Jeffrey Harmon in the end. Did Jeffrey Harmon look like a murderer? No. Is he a monster? Yes. And he acted out being precisely that. A seemingly mild-mannered guy who was anything but trust no one. This case is an indication of that. Trust no one.
The year was 1888, and the heart of London pulsed with a rhythm both intoxicating and dangerous. Gas lamps flickered weakly through the fog, their dim halos swallowed by the thickness of smoke and coal dust that lingered in the night air. Carriages clattered unevenly across cobbled streets, their wheels splashing through the filth of open gutters. And in the East End, in that labyrinth of alleyways and narrow courts, poverty and desperation lived side by side with secrets too heavy for daylight. Whitechapel was not just a district. It was a wound, festering with the stench of overcrowding, disease, and decay. Thousands of souls packed into lodging houses, sleeping 4 to a bed, or sprawled in ditches if a coin could not be spared. Women, gaunt and weary, leaned against brick walls, waiting for the night to offer them some meager earnings. Men stumbled drunkenly from taverns, pockets empty, eyes clouded with anger or despair. And yet, in that world of grime and shadow, life persisted. Children ran barefoot through puddles. Mothers bargained fiercely in markets. Preachers called out salvation on street corners. But beneath it all, a current of fear stirred, a fear that in the fall of that year would erupt into horror beyond imagination. It began with whispers, rumors carried on the damp air. A woman found dead in the early hours, her throat cut savagely. The mutilation so ghastly that even hardened policemen turned pale. At first, many dismissed it as drunken violence, the kind that stained Whitechapel often enough. But the brutality spoke of something more deliberate, something colder. This was not the fury of a drunken hand. This was the work of a predator. And as the nights lengthened, as autumn settled its chill over the city, that predator would strike again and again, until the very name he signed in his letters, Jack the Ripper, became a legend drenched in blood. But to understand how terror took root in London, we must step back into those streets, into the nights that smelled of gin and coal smoke, where shadows stretched long and every sound carried the possibility of menace. The people of Whitechapel were hardened by suffering, yet nothing could prepare them for the string of killings that would make their alleys infamous for eternity. The first to fall was Mary Ann Nichols, known to her friends as Polly. She was 43 years old, a woman who had long battled poverty, broken relationships, and the merciless hand of addiction. On the night of August 30th, 1888, Polly was seen staggering along Whitechapel Road, desperate for the price of a bed in a lodging house. She had earned some coins earlier, but spent them quickly on gin. "I'll soon get my DOS money," she told her companion with a half-smile, before vanishing into the darkness. Hours later, in the early dawn of August 31st, her body was found lying in Buck's Row, her throat cut twice, so deeply it nearly severed her head. Her abdomen had been slashed open, exposing the horror within. The silence of that narrow street was broken only by the footsteps of the constable who stumbled upon her, and in that instant, Whitechapel became a hunting ground. The police arrived swiftly, but already the crime scene had begun to lose its purity. Curious onlookers gathered, drawn morbidly by the news that spread like fire. In the gaslight, officers studied the savagery of the wounds, realizing this was no ordinary killing. The slashes were precise, almost surgical. Whoever had done this either possessed anatomical knowledge or a deranged obsession with the human body. For Inspector John Spratling, who oversaw the first examination, the conclusion was chilling. This was not the random rage of a street brawl. This was calculated, intentional, and monstrous. Polly Nichols was buried quietly, her coffin lowered into the ground as her family wept. But the East End did not have time to mourn. Just 1 week later, another woman's life would be stolen with the same cold brutality. Her name was Annie Chapman. At 47, her health was failing. her body weakened by years of hard living. On the evening of September 7th, Annie too wandered the streets, her pockets empty. She sought coins for lodging, offering herself in exchange for a meal or a bed. At dawn the next day, September 8th, her body was discovered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. The sight was more horrifying than anything seen before. Her throat had been cut deeply, and her abdomen laid open with organs grotesquely removed. Near her feet lay 2 small brass rings, perhaps stripped from her fingers in a final act of contempt. For the detectives who stood over her corpse, there was no longer any doubt. A serial killer walked among them. Panic began to spread through Whitechapel like an infection. Newspapers splashed the murders across their front pages, their headlines shrieking words of terror. Crowds gathered at the crime scenes, pushing past cordons, desperate to glimpse the horror. Journalists wove tales of a bloodthirsty madman stalking the streets, and the public's imagination ran wild. Who could commit such atrocities? Some whispered of a butcher, others of a surgeon, others still of a foreign monster lurking in their midst. Theories blossomed, but answers remained elusive. All the while, the killer slipped silently back into the fog, waiting for his next moment. The police, overwhelmed and under immense pressure, intensified their patrols. Constables roamed the streets with lanterns, their boots echoing in the night. Informants were questioned, suspects detained, but each lead unraveled into nothingness. Scotland Yard deployed its top detectives, including the famed Inspector Frederick Aberline, a man hardened by years of policing the East End. Yet even he, with his keen instincts, found himself chasing shadows. The killer left no footprints, no fingerprints, no witnesses who lived long enough to speak. He struck with speed and vanished like smoke. On September 30th, the horror escalated. That night, known ever after as the double event, 2 women were murdered within the span of an hour. Elizabeth Stride was the first. She was discovered in Dutfield's yard, her throat cut, blood pooling beneath her. Yet unlike the others, her body bore no further mutilations. Was the killer interrupted? Did footsteps or a sudden noise drive him away before he could complete his grotesque ritual? The question has haunted investigators ever since. But while police swarmed to the scene, the killer had already moved on, his hunger unquenched. Less than an hour later, the body of Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square. The mutilations were savage beyond belief. Her face had been slashed into grotesque shapes, her organs cut and removed with chilling precision. The brutality of the act left even seasoned officers shaken, their stomachs turning as they struggled to record the details. For London, the realization was inescapable. A monster was loose in their city, and no one was safe. The morning after the double event, panic erupted. Crowds filled the streets, their anger boiling. They cursed the police for their failure. They demanded protection, and they demanded the monster be caught. It was then that letters began to arrive. Taunting, mocking, written in a hand that dripped with cruelty. Addressed to the police and the press, they were signed with a name that would echo across history, Jack the Ripper. In red ink he boasted of his killings, promised more blood, and laughed at those who hunted him. Whether all the letters were truly from the killer or not remains debated, but their impact was undeniable. Fear became hysteria, and hysteria became legend. Meanwhile, in Whitechapel, the women of the night walked with trembling steps. They clutched each coin tighter, glanced over their shoulders more often, but poverty left them no choice. Hunger and cold drove them into the darkness, into the arms of strangers who might be their salvation or their executioner. They knew the risk, but survival left no room for hesitation, and always in the shadows Jack the Ripper watched. In the weeks that followed, detectives traced every rumor. They interrogated doctors, slaughterhouse workers, sailors fresh off ships. They searched lodging houses, taverns, and brothels. Yet the killer seemed always a step ahead, dissolving into the fog like a ghost. Fear settled heavy over the city. Parents kept their daughters indoors. Newspapers sold by the thousands as readers devoured every chilling detail. London itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next scream, the next body in the gutter. And then, in the first days of November, he struck again. The first days of November brought with them a biting wind that swept through London's alleys, rattling shutters and carrying with it the acrid smoke of countless chimneys. The nights grew darker, the fog denser, and in Whitechapel the people moved as though under a curse. They had seen too much already. Polly Nichols butchered in Bucks Row, Annie Chapman torn apart in Hanbury Street, Elizabeth Stride's throat cut in Dutfield's Yard, and Catherine Eddowes mutilated beyond recognition in Mitre Square. 4 women dead, their blood soaking into the cobblestones of the East End, and still no man in chains to answer for it. The killer had mocked the police in his letters, slipping into their very hands words scrawled in red that chilled the soul. "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper," he had signed. The name alone became a weapon, one more terrifying than the knife he wielded. To speak it aloud was to conjure the shadow of death, and yet, despite the fear that clung to every street corner, life in Whitechapel staggered forward. The pubs overflowed with men numbing themselves with gin. Women leaned against damp brick walls, whispering offers to passers-by, and children slept beneath torn blankets, huddled together for warmth. Hunger did not wait for safety. Desperation had no patience for fear. For many, the night was the only chance to scrape together a few coins to buy bread, or to pay for a shared bed in a filthy lodging-house. They walked into the fog because they had no choice, and the Ripper, as if knowing this, waited for them. On the night of November 8, 1888, Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest of his known victims, prepared for the cold in her tiny room at 13 Miller's Court. Unlike the others, she had a room of her own, though it was scarcely more than 4 crumbling walls and a roof that leaked when it rained. She was just 25 years old, with auburn hair and a fragile beauty that belied the misery of her life. Some said she sang sweetly in taverns, her voice carrying through the smoke and laughter, but poverty had long since forced her into the same dangerous trade as the women before her. That evening, she was seen drinking with acquaintances, laughing softly, perhaps to hide the weight pressing on her shoulders. As the hours ticked into the early morning of November 9th, she was spotted leading a man back to her room, his face obscured by the fog and by the silence of history. She closed the door behind them. It was the last time she was seen alive. The morning that followed would deliver horror beyond anything Whitechapel had yet endured. At around 10:45, her landlord's assistant, anxious over unpaid rent, knocked at her door. Receiving no answer, he peered through a broken window pane. What he saw froze him in place, his breath caught in his throat, his body shaking as he stumbled back into the street. Mary Jane Kelly's body lay sprawled on her bed, but it was no longer the body of a woman. It was a canvas of destruction, a mutilation so thorough, so unspeakably cruel, that seasoned detectives could barely stand the sight. Her throat had been slashed to the spine, her body disemboweled, her organs removed and arranged around the room in grotesque display. Her face, once soft and lively, was hacked beyond recognition, reduced to a mask of horror. It was not murder. It was desecration. It was as though the killer had unleashed every ounce of his madness in that one final frenzy. News of Mary Jane Kelly's death struck London like a thunderclap. Word spread through the East End with terrifying speed, and soon a crowd gathered in Dorset Street, their faces pale, their voices trembling. Dorset Street was already notorious, called by some the worst street in London, but that day it became the very heart of the nightmare. Police blocked the entrance, keeping the crowd at bay, but the whispers grew louder, angrier. Mothers clutched their daughters tighter, men shouted curses into the fog, and everyone demanded the same thing. Why had this monster not been stopped? Scotland Yard reeled under the pressure. Detectives poured over the scene, measuring, sketching, cataloguing. But what use was evidence when the killer had once again vanished into thin air? Inside that room, Inspector Frederick Aberline stood in grim silence. He had seen death before, more times than he cared to count, but nothing like this. The sheer savagery of it, the fury etched into every wound. It was as if the Ripper had poured his very soul into tearing Mary Jane apart. Aberline knew then what many feared. This was no ordinary killer. This was obsession, ritual, perhaps even madness crafted into method. And yet, like smoke between fingers, the murderer slipped through every attempt to catch him. The frustration gnawed at Aberline, even as the press feasted on every detail, spinning headlines that screamed across the nation, "The monster of Whitechapel strikes again." In the days that followed, the city reached its breaking point. Patrols doubled, constables swarmed the alleys, detectives shadowed suspects, but nothing came. And then, without warning, the killing ceased. After Mary Jane Kelly, no more bodies were found. The silence was almost as terrifying as the screams had been. Had the Ripper fled? Had he been jailed for another crime, hidden away from the public eye? Or had he simply grown tired, his thirst for blood finally quenched? London held its breath, waiting, but the knife no longer carved its path through the night. The mystery deepened, and in its absence, theories bloomed like weeds. Some whispered that the Ripper was a butcher, skilled with knives, his apron forever stained with blood. Others claimed he was a doctor, his knowledge of anatomy evident in the precise removal of organs. Still others pointed to foreign sailors, to secret cults, to mad aristocrats slipping out of mansions to indulge unspeakable desires. Each theory added fuel to the fire. Each rumor spread faster than the last. The newspapers, their sales soaring with every bloody headline, eagerly published each new claim, stoking panic and fascination alike. Jack the Ripper was no longer just a killer. He had become a phantom, a legend, a name spoken in every pub and every parlor across the empire. But for the women of Whitechapel, the legend was no comfort. They still walked the streets each night, still faced the gnawing hunger that forced them into strangers' arms. Even if the Ripper's knife no longer sliced through the fog, the fear remained, woven into the very fabric of their lives. Every footstep behind them, every shadow at the corner of their eye. It might be him. And perhaps that was his greatest victory, not only the bodies he left behind, but the terror that lingered long after his blade was gone. For the police, the case became a labyrinth with no exit. Dozens of suspects were questioned, names recorded, lives examined under the harsh light of suspicion. One of the earliest suspects was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher found dead in the Thames in December 1888. His suicide, coinciding with the end of the murders, led some to believe the Ripper had killed himself, his demons finally consuming him. Others suspected Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant and barber with a history of mental illness, committed to an asylum years later. His name would resurface again and again in whispers of police files. Still others believed in a man named Michael Ostrog, a Russian doctor with a criminal record, though evidence against him was scarce. And then there was Leather Apron, a nickname given to John Pizer, a Jewish shoemaker feared by many local women. Though quickly cleared of suspicion, his name stained the headlines, feeding xenophobia and stoking fury in the streets. Each suspect seemed plausible, each theory tantalizing, but none fit perfectly. The Ripper was a puzzle with pieces missing, a ghost who left only fragments behind. Scotland Yard grew desperate, even offering rewards for information, but no witness came forward with the face of the killer. No confession was ever heard, no trial ever held. And as winter deepened, the city slowly realized a terrifying truth. Jack the Ripper might never be caught. For some, that uncertainty was unbearable. They demanded answers, demanded names, demanded justice for Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. But for others, the mystery only heightened the fascination. Pamphlets and penny dreadfuls sold lurid tales of the murders. Tourists flocked to Whitechapel, eager to walk the alleys where death had prowled. Children whispered the name as though invoking a ghost story, never fully grasping the horror behind it. Jack the Ripper became both terror and entertainment, fear and myth entwined. And in that myth, a darker truth lingered. The women who died were poor, vulnerable, forgotten by society until their blood stained the cobblestones. Their names became footnotes in the shadow of the killer who took them. Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, Mary Jane. They were more than victims. They were lives, stories, voices silenced in the night. But the world remembered the Ripper, the Phantom, the faceless terror. Perhaps that was the cruelest cut of all. As 1888 drew to a close, the fog thickened over London, and in Whitechapel the alleys grew quiet once more. Yet the silence was not peace. It was suspense, an unfinished sentence, a breath held too long. The knife was gone, but the shadow remained. And though the year turned, and the city marched forward into the next decade, the name Jack the Ripper remained carved into the bones of London, a scar that time would never fully heal. The year after the murders of 1888 began as if London were holding its breath, as though the entire city stood at the edge of a precipice, waiting for the knife to flash again. The people of Whitechapel no longer walked their streets with the same careless resignation to poverty. They moved as though pursued, eyes darting to every corner, every silhouette in the fog. Mothers no longer let daughters wander, and the nightly trade of survival became a gauntlet of terror. But weeks passed, then months, and the killings did not return. The silence brought no comfort. It was not relief they felt, but unease, as if the predator had not gone, but merely stepped back into the shadows, watching, biding his time. The police, too, found no peace. Inspector Aberline remained restless, his mind circling endlessly around the unanswered questions. Each report, each statement, each scrap of rumor passed through his hands until the words blurred into one long scream. He replayed the nights in his mind, imagined footsteps echoing through empty alleys, the flicker of a lantern against blood on stone. How had they failed? How had a killer moved so freely through their grasp, leaving only mutilation in his wake? Scotland Yard had promised the public resolution, but none came. The Home Secretary was besieged with letters demanding answers, demanding heads roll if justice could not be delivered. The image of the Metropolitan Police was battered, their authority mocked in taverns and broadsheets alike. And all the while, Jack the Ripper's legend grew. Even as the killings ceased, letters continued to arrive. Some were crude forgeries, obvious attempts to exploit fear for attention. Others were more convincing, their words drenched in the same cruel humor and taunting confidence as before. The most infamous of all, the so-called From Hell letter, arrived in late October, sent to George Lusk, head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. It was wrapped with a grisly trophy, half a human kidney preserved in alcohol. The letter was brief, scrawled in crude handwriting. From Hell. Mr. Lusk, sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman and preserved it for you. The other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. Catch me when you can. Jack the Ripper. Whether the organ truly belonged to Catherine Eddowes, who had been found missing a kidney, remains debated, but the effect was undeniable. The horror deepened. The monster was not only killing, but mocking them from the very heart of darkness. The Vigilance Committee, a band of local citizens frustrated by police failure, patrolled the streets at night with lanterns and sticks, hoping to catch the killer themselves. They were shopkeepers, tradesmen, laborers, ordinary men hardened by desperation. But though their presence brought a sense of defiance, they too found nothing. The fog swallowed their shouts, the alleys echoed with their boots, but the Ripper eluded them. It was as if he were always one step beyond the lantern light, smiling in the dark. Speculation turned obsessive. Pamphlets were printed, circulating names and faces of supposed suspects. Doctors found themselves eyed with suspicion, their knowledge of anatomy twisted into accusation. Foreigners bore the brunt of fear, immigrants targeted by angry mobs who cried out that London's nightmare had been imported from abroad. The Jewish community, already marginalized, became scapegoats in the fever of paranoia, their businesses vandalized, their safety threatened. Hatred, like blood, seeped into the cobblestones. Among the theories, some shone brighter than others, tantalizing in their plausibility. A few investigators whispered about a royal connection, a scandal buried beneath layers of secrecy. The tale spoke of Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria, entangled with women of ill repute, and of powerful hands silencing anyone who might expose him. The idea of a cover-up thrilled the press, even as officials dismissed it. Others believed the Ripper was an artist of death, driven by ritual, his mutilations not random but symbolic, a grotesque language carved into flesh. Still others pointed to secret societies, to Freemasons, to conspiracies hidden behind closed doors. Each theory became another shadow in an already darkened street. But amid the swirling rumors, one truth remained constant. The women had been real, flesh and blood, their laughter and tears extinguished in an instant. Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. They were not merely names in headlines. They were mothers, daughters, friends, their lives pressed down by poverty until their final breaths were stolen in violence. And while the world obsessed over the faceless killer, their stories faded like candlelight in a storm. Inspector Aberline never forgot them. In quiet moments, he thought of Annie Chapman's brass rings left discarded in the dirt, of Catherine Eddowes' mutilated face staring lifelessly in Mitre Square. He thought of Mary Jane Kelly's room, its walls painted with horror, an image that returned to him in dreams. For all his years in service, nothing had scarred him like those nights in 1888. He chased leads for years after, long after the case had grown cold, as though unable to admit defeat. Some said the Ripper had destroyed more than his victims. He had shattered the very soul of the man who hunted him. As the 1890s unfolded, time did not erase the memory, but transformed it. Jack the Ripper became more than a man. He became a legend, his shadow stretching far beyond Whitechapel. Penny, Dreadfuls painted him as a phantom, stalking fog-shrouded alleys with a gleaming knife. Stage plays dramatized his crimes, thrilling audiences with terror dressed as entertainment. Writers and scholars debated his motives, his identity, as if decoding a riddle written in blood. The Ripper was no longer confined to the East End. He had become London's dark reflection, the embodiment of fear that even the Empire's might could not banish. But beneath the fascination, the unanswered questions festered. What kind of man could commit such acts and then vanish so completely? Had he died, unremarked and unknown, his secret buried with him in a pauper's grave? Had he fled across the sea, carrying his knife to other unsuspecting streets? Or worse, had he lived on among them, ordinary by day, monstrous by night, his face blending into the crowds that cursed his name? The uncertainty gnawed at the city's conscience, for to believe he was gone was to hope. To believe he still walked among them was to never sleep soundly again. In taverns, stories grew taller with every retelling. Men swore they had seen him slip into the fog, that they had heard footsteps vanish behind them, that they had glimpsed a shadow too long in the lamplight. Women told of strange men whispering promises in the night, of eyes that gleamed with hunger. The myth fed itself, growing stronger as the years passed, until Jack the Ripper became less a killer than a curse. To this day, the name is spoken like a spell, evoking both dread and fascination, and still, the faces of the women linger in silence. They are the ghosts of Whitechapel, their cries carried in the wind that sweeps through Dorset Street and Hanbury Street, through Mitre Square and Bucks Row. Their lives ended in fear, but their deaths lit a fire that still burns. They remind us that Jack the Ripper's story is not only his, but theirs. 5 women who lived, who fought, who suffered, who died. And though history etched his name into legend, it was written first in their blood. As the century turned, London grew brighter, taller, grander. Electric lamps replaced gaslights. Carriages gave way to motor cars. The empire expanded its reach. But in Whitechapel, the scars remained. Lodging houses still crowded the poor, taverns still poured cheap gin, and the fog still rolled in thick from the Thames. And in every whisper, every shiver in the night, the ghost of Jack the Ripper lingered, a reminder that even in the heart of civilization, the darkness was never far away. The knife was silent. The hands that held it long since dust, and yet the legend endured. Alive in every shadow, every fearful glance, every retelling of those nights when London was held captive by terror. Jack the Ripper had vanished, but he had never left. London had moved into the new decade, but Whitechapel never escaped 1888. The fog that rolled from the Thames carried with it the memory of screams, the echo of boots on cobblestones, the glint of steel beneath a lantern. People said the killings had ended, but in every shadow they still searched for him. Jack the Ripper had carved not only into flesh, but into the very soul of the city. His presence lingered in alleys and attics, in dreams and drunken mutterings, in the unsteady hands of policemen who could not forget what they had seen. Inspector Aberline remained haunted. Though the files had grown cold, his mind never cooled. Each night, as the gaslights dimmed and silence settled over Whitechapel, he found himself drawn back to the images that refused to fade. Polly Nichols, sprawled in Bucks Row, Annie Chapman's lifeless body in Hanbury Street, Elizabeth Stride with her life stolen before mutilation could follow, Catherine Eddowes' face hacked into a grotesque mask, Mary Jane Kelly's room transformed into a slaughterhouse. He replayed every detail as though somewhere, in the chaos of blood, the answer might be hidden. He had sworn an oath to uphold the law, to bring justice where justice had been denied. But in the case of Jack the Ripper, justice was a door forever locked. The newspapers did not let him rest either. Every few months, a new headline screamed of a sighting, a confession, a theory. "Is Jack the Ripper abroad?" asked one paper when a woman was murdered in Paris. "Has the fiend returned?" shrieked another when a mutilated body was found in New York. The killings elsewhere bore similarities, but never certainty. The name Jack the Ripper had become a mold that every unsolved crime was poured into. Even crimes far from Whitechapel now wore his mask. He was everywhere and nowhere, his legend feeding itself with each retelling. Theories grew more elaborate, twisting themselves into webs of intrigue. Some whispered of a painter named Walter Sickert, whose artwork seemed to echo the brutality of the murders. His canvases held faces distorted, bodies broken, shadows lurking. Too close to coincidence, some said. Others clung to the belief that the killer was one of their own, a policeman who knew the patrols too well, who walked with authority and disappeared without suspicion. Conspiracies multiplied. Freemasons, royals, foreign agents, each theory more dramatic, each more impossible to disprove. And as the mystery thickened, the truth slipped further away. But there was one place the truth lived, raw and undeniable, the streets themselves. Whitechapel bore scars deeper than any theory could describe. For the poor women who still walked the alleys at night, survival meant enduring not only hunger and cold, but also the ghost of the Ripper. Every client might be him. Every bargain struck beneath a gaslight could end in silence. The fear had etched itself into them, sharpening their instincts, quickening their pace, hardening their stares. They lived as prey who knew the predator might never be caught. Mary Jane Kelly's death had been the climax of the nightmare, the last great scream before silence fell. But silence was not peace. Dorset Street became infamous, called the Street of Blood, and people crossed themselves when they passed its entrance. Miller's Court was torn down years later, its bricks scattered, as if destroying the place could exorcise the memory. Yet memory clung stubbornly. No matter how many walls were rebuilt, the image of that room, the bed, the body, the blood, remained carved into the conscience of the city. As decades passed, the Ripper became a mirror for society's fears. Each new age projected onto him what it most dreaded. In the Victorian era, he embodied the terror of the slums, the collapse of order, the danger of those whom poverty had abandoned. In later years, he was painted as the face of insanity, a warning of the unhinged mind lurking within civilized society. For some, he represented misogyny at its most extreme, a hatred of women carved into flesh. For others, he was the specter of modernity itself, the dark underside of progress that gaslights and railways could not illuminate. He was all of these, and none of them, a phantom that shifted shape with every telling. But behind every theory, every myth, there were the bodies, the women whose lives ended in alleys, whose blood marked the stones. Their names often slipped into the background, overshadowed by the man who killed them. Yet without them, there was no Jack the Ripper. Their faces haunted not only Aberline, but London itself, though too often forgotten by a world obsessed with the phantom. Even Queen Victoria herself demanded answers. She wrote to her ministers, furious at the failures of her police, pressing them for more thorough investigations, for harsher measures. How could the greatest empire in the world not catch a single man, one who left his trail painted in red? The question hung in the air, a condemnation that echoed in Parliament and in pubs alike. The Ripper had humiliated not only Whitechapel, but all of London. The humiliation grew deeper when the killings spawned imitation. Men wrote false confessions, craving attention. Others sent letters signed with his name, delighting in the fear their ink could provoke. Copycats struck in other cities, drawing their knives in alleys, hoping to steal the infamy. The Ripper's shadow stretched across borders, across oceans, until he was no longer only London's nightmare, but the world's. And yet, even as his legend spread, the truth of his identity slipped further into darkness. Police reports gathered dust, files locked away in archives. Suspects died, evidence vanished, witnesses faded into memory. By the time the century turned, Jack the Ripper had already begun his transformation from murderer into myth. What remained was not the man, but the fear he had birthed, a fear that did not die with the passing of years. Still, in Whitechapel, there were nights when the fog rolled so thick it seemed to choke the very breath from the air, and in those nights the people swore they could feel him again. A shadow at the edge of vision, footsteps that vanished when pursued. the faint metallic scent of blood carried on the mist. He was gone, yes, but gone did not mean forgotten. The Ripper had stolen more than 5 lives. He had stolen the very sense of safety from a city that prided itself on order and law. He had turned the East End into a theater of fear, the stage lit by gas lamps, the actors unaware until the final curtain fell in blood. And though the curtain closed in 1888, the play never truly ended. Its echoes continue still, every time the name is whispered, every time someone dares to peer too long into the fog. The autumn of 1888 had ended in silence. But silence in Whitechapel was never true peace. It was the silence of dread, a waiting silence, as though the city itself held its breath, unsure if the knife would rise again. The gas lamps still flickered on the corners, casting trembling circles of yellow onto wet cobblestones. The fog still moved like a living thing, curling through alleys, swallowing figures whole. And in every shadow, the people imagined him, Jack, the faceless man who had carved his terror into the very marrow of London. He had stopped killing, but stopping was not the same as leaving. His ghost remained, sharper than any blade. In the months that followed Mary Jane Kelly's death, Whitechapel lived with a strange contradiction. On one hand, relief grew that no new bodies had been found. On the other, suspicion and paranoia poisoned every interaction. Men were eyed with mistrust. Women moved quickly through the streets. Constables doubled their rounds. Yet it was never enough. The question hung heavy in every tavern, every market stall, every whisper at the lodging houses. Had Jack the Ripper truly gone, or was he only waiting? The police archives swelled with paper, witness statements stacked high, sketches of wounds, maps of alleys, letters scrawled in red ink and signed with the name that chilled the spine. Detectives chased leads like men drowning, clutching at splinters of wood in a vast sea. Some pointed to the asylum records, believing the Ripper must have been confined, hidden away behind iron bars. Others insisted he was dead, perhaps his body rotting in a shallow grave with his secret intact. Still others believed he had fled London, carrying his knife across oceans, seeking new streets to haunt. Yet none of these theories came with proof. They were whispers against the silence. But silence was not absence. Silence was power. Jack the Ripper had achieved what few killers ever could. He had vanished not only from sight, but from certainty. And in that uncertainty, he grew larger. His name no longer belonged only to the crimes of 1888. It became a symbol, a cloak thrown over any mystery that bore the scent of blood. A woman strangled in Paris? Perhaps the Ripper had crossed the Channel. A mutilation in New York? Perhaps the Ripper had boarded a ship. Each new unsolved killing carried his ghost, until the phantom stretched across continents. He was no longer a man. He was an idea. And ideas cannot be handcuffed. For Inspector Aberline, the years that followed were heavy with unfinished business. He was promoted, transferred, given new cases, but none carried the weight of Whitechapel. He carried the Ripper with him like a second shadow. Each time he read of a new killing, his mind returned to Hanbury Street, to Mitre Square, to Miller's Court. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Mary Jane Kelly's room, the bed drenched in horror. He could not escape. The case was not only unsolved, it was unsolvable, a wound that refused to close. And it was not only the police who carried the burden. The women of Whitechapel bore it most of all. The killings had painted them as prey, as shadows in alleys waiting for the knife. Their poverty had always endangered them, but the Ripper had turned their danger into spectacle. Even as the world moved on, they could not forget. Every transaction on the street corner, every drunken hand that gripped too tightly, carried the echo of the Ripper's blade. They lived not only with hunger and cold, but with memory, and memory is a cruel companion. The press, hungry for headlines, did not let the fear fade. Years after the killings, stories still filled their pages. New clues in the Ripper mystery, they announced, though the clues were nothing but speculation. Identity at last, they teased, though the names shifted like sand. Each article rekindled the fear, each headline kept the wounds open. The newspapers had made Jack the Ripper immortal. His name sold papers, and in selling papers, his story never died. Then came the imitators. Letters signed Jack the Ripper appeared in towns far from London, written by pranksters, lunatics, or opportunists. Each stroke of ink was another knife twisted into the hearts of those who still mourned. Even decades later, murders with no clear culprit were linked back to him. Some called them copycats. Others believed the Ripper had never truly stopped, that his hand continued its work under new moons, on new streets. The ambiguity itself was his greatest weapon. A killer forgotten is a killer defeated. But Jack the Ripper was never forgotten. He had achieved the ultimate crime, not only against flesh, but against time, and so the myth thickened, like fog refusing to lift. Jack the Ripper became the faceless terror of Victorian London, the name whispered in gaslit parlors, the monster who lurked just beyond the lamplight. He was the shadow of progress, the proof that even as the city modernized, built railways and factories, raised spires and monuments, darkness still lived at its core. He was civilization's reminder that beneath polished boots and tailored coats lay the same primal violence that had haunted humanity for centuries. But myths have a cruel way of erasing truth. The women he killed were buried beneath the weight of his legend. Their names spoken less often than his, their lives forgotten, their deaths remembered only for the horror they carried. Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, Mary Jane, 5 women who laughed, who worked, who hoped, who fought, who struggled, who died. They were mothers, daughters, friends. They were human. And yet, in the world's memory, they became only victims. It was Jack's name that endured, his shadow that stretched long, while theirs faded into silence. The silence of the victims is the loudest sound of all. It asks a question the city could never answer. How could their lives matter so little until they were taken? How could the empire's crown gleam so brightly while its streets hid such despair? Jack the Ripper's knife cut deeper than skin. It cut into society itself, exposing rot beneath the marble. The East End was not an accident, not a forgotten corner. It was the truth of London, poverty festering while wealth paraded in palaces. And in 1888, the knife made that truth impossible to ignore, but ignoring is what came after. The killings ended, the city rebuilt its rhythm, and Whitechapel's poor remained poor. The newspapers moved on to new scandals, new wars, new spectacles. The women's bodies were lowered into the ground, and life staggered forward. Yet the Ripper remained, his story told again and again, each retelling more dramatic, more mysterious, more divorced from the reality of 5 women whose blood stained the stones. The myth grew even as the truth shrank, and still the fog lingered. Still the footsteps echoed. Still, in the silence of certain nights, the people swore they felt him again. Jack the Ripper had not only haunted their streets, he had claimed their imagination, their fear, their history, and history, once claimed, is never given back. The shadow of Jack the Ripper did not vanish with the close of the 19th century. It lengthened. It darkened. It grew with each retelling, each theory whispered in smoke-filled taverns or published in headlines that screamed of revelations. London itself changed. Gas lamps gave way to electric light, horse-drawn carriages to motor cars, factories rose higher, and streets widened. But in the alleys of Whitechapel, the air remained heavy with memory. The stones that once drank the blood of 5 women were walked upon daily by men and women who could not forget. Every echo of boots in the fog still carried with it the weight of 1888. What kept the fear alive was not simply that the killer had escaped, but that he had escaped so completely. He had walked into the heart of the largest city in the world, struck repeatedly with grotesque violence, and then dissolved into thin air. It was impossible. It defied reason. And because reason could not explain it, imagination filled the void. Jack the Ripper became less a man than a phantom, a presence who had stepped beyond the reach of handcuffs, beyond the reach of justice, beyond even the reach of death. To many he was eternal, a specter who could never be caught because he was no longer flesh at all. In the years after the murders, the list of suspects multiplied. Each man accused carried with him a story of darkness, a reason why he might fit the monstrous figure. Aaron Kosminski, the troubled Polish immigrant whose insanity and hatred of women made him a convenient culprit. Michael Ostrog, a criminal with a history of violence, whose name was whispered with suspicion though never proven guilty. Montague John Druitt, the schoolteacher and barrister who drowned himself in the Thames, his death coinciding too neatly with the end of the killings. And then there were the aristocrats, the doctors, the foreigners, the policemen themselves. Each theory seemed convincing in its moment. Each suspect seemed plausible, yet none ever held against scrutiny. The Ripper was a chameleon, fitting into every shadow, wearing every mask, and yet never truly revealed. The very failure to name him transformed him into something more frightening than any identified killer could ever be. Murderers behind bars are men. Murderers hanged at the gallows are men. But a murderer who walks into the fog and leaves no trace, that is no longer a man. That is legend. The legend drew not only fear, but fascination. Ordinary citizens who once trembled at his name began to speak it with a strange kind of thrill. Jack the Ripper became entertainment. His crimes retold in lurid pamphlets, his shadow dramatized on stages, his name stamped into penny dreadfuls that children read by candlelight. He became a character, a villain cloaked in the mystery of the unknown. The world could not look away. The same newspapers that had once pleaded for his capture now printed his name to sell copies. Fear had become profit, and in profit the Ripper lived forever. Yet beneath the myth, the true horror remained. 5 women had died, their bodies torn open in ways no stage play could ever truly capture. They had been poor, desperate, alone, and forgotten by society until their deaths made them headlines. They had been human, and humanity was stolen from them not only by the knife, but by the centuries of retellings that painted them as props in the story of a phantom. Even their graves could not escape the shadow of the man who had killed them. They were remembered only as his victims, not as themselves. Inspector Aberline lived the rest of his days under that shadow. He retired from the force, but never from the memory. In his final years, when asked, he admitted with bitterness that Jack the Ripper had never been caught, never been unmasked. He spoke with the weariness of a man who had stared into a void and found no end. And perhaps in his silence, there was an understanding that the Ripper could never truly be caught, not because he was cleverer than the police, but because he had already become something larger than them. He had become an idea, and ideas are beyond the reach of law. The 20th century only deepened the fascination. Each new generation reopened the case, dusted off the files, peered at the photographs of mutilated bodies, studied the maps of Whitechapel's streets. Each new investigator declared they had found the truth, that they had uncovered the face behind the legend. Yet each truth contradicted the last. Some pointed to royal scandal, weaving tales of cover-ups and conspiracies. Others pointed to artists, their canvases twisted into evidence. Others still turned to new sciences, seeking DNA in scraps of cloth, fingerprints in old photographs. The more they searched, the more elusive he became. The fog thickened with every step, and through it all, Jack the Ripper laughed, not with sound, but with silence. The silence of a case unsolved. The silence of alleys where the only witnesses were shadows. The silence of a legend too large to be pinned down by facts. That silence was his victory. For the people of Whitechapel, however, victory was hollow. Poverty did not vanish with the Ripper. The women of the East End still sold themselves in alleys to survive, still risked their lives for a handful of coins, still lived with hunger gnawing at their bones. The Ripper had not created their suffering. He had only carved into it. He had exposed it, made it visible for the world to see. And when the world looked, it looked with horror at the knife, not at the conditions that had driven women into the alleys in the first place. The Empire shuddered at the name of Jack the Ripper, but turned away from the poverty that birthed his victims. That was the greater crime, and it remained unsolved. The shadow of 1888 lingered into every decade that followed. Writers turned it into fiction, filmmakers into horror, historians into puzzles. And always the question remained, who was he? Who walked those streets with a knife glinting in the fog? Was he a madman, drooling in shadows, overcome by urges he could not control? Or was he a gentleman, polished and cold, who returned to his drawing rooms after carving death into the poor? Was he one of the many suspects whose names filled the police files? Or was he none of them, his name lost to time, his face buried in anonymity, each possibility terrified in its own way? But perhaps the greatest terror was not that he was extraordinary, but that he was ordinary. That Jack the Ripper was not a monster born of myth, but a man like any other, walking the same streets, buying bread from the same markets, passing unnoticed in the daylight. To believe he was ordinary was to confront the truth that the potential for such horror lives not in phantoms, but in men, and that truth is harder to face than any ghost. London modernized, grew brighter, louder, safer, but Whitechapel kept its whispers. Even today, when tourists walk its streets on guided tours, when historians trace the alleys with maps in hand, there is a weight in the air that has not lifted since 1888. The stones remember. The fog remembers. And when the night grows thick and footsteps echo in the distance, it is easy to believe the Ripper still walks there, hidden just beyond the lamplight, waiting for history to blink so he can step forward again. Jack the Ripper was never caught. Jack the Ripper was never unmasked. Jack the Ripper remains, not only in the pages of history, but in the imagination of every soul who dares to wander too deep into the fog of Whitechapel. Time is supposed to bury memory, but some memories resist the grave. Jack the Ripper's shadow did not fade with the gas lamps of the 19th century. It stretched into the 20th, then into the 21st, alive in whispers, alive in ink, alive in fear. Each decade promised answers, yet each decade left the mystery intact. The fog of Whitechapel still clung to the world's imagination, and in that fog, the Ripper still walked. The police files became relics, boxes of yellowed paper filled with sketches, reports, and testimonies that led nowhere. Scholars combed them, journalists devoured them, amateurs obsessed over them. Each word was studied as if the ink itself might betray the killer's identity. The photographs, blurred, gruesome glimpses of the aftermath, were passed from hand to trembling hand, the horror preserved in fading black and white, and still the answer remained elusive. Every theory solved the riddle, yet none truly fit. It was as though the case had been designed to resist resolution, a knot that tightened with each attempt to unravel it. Some believed that modern science would finally pierce the fog. Forensic experts turned to DNA, scraping fragments from old letters, from scraps of clothing, from preserved evidence kept for more than a century. Headlines trumpeted breakthroughs, Ripper's identity revealed. Yet each claim collapsed under scrutiny. Contamination, incomplete samples, misinterpretation. Science could not deliver what history had lost. The Ripper had slipped through not only the hands of the Victorian police, but through the microscopes of the future, and so the fascination deepened. Jack the Ripper became not just London's nightmare, but the world's puzzle. Books filled shelves with new theories, each promising revelation, each adding another mask to the faceless killer. Documentaries retraced the murders, actors stalking fog-drenched sets with knives glinting under artificial gaslight. Tourists walked the streets of Whitechapel, led by guides carrying lanterns, stopping at corners where women had fallen. They listened with wide eyes as the story was told again, as though repetition could conjure truth from shadow. The alleys became stages, the stones became props, and the blood of 1888 was performed nightly for those who sought a thrill. But behind the thrill, behind the spectacle, lay a deeper unease. Jack the Ripper had not only killed 5 women, he had stripped them of their humanity. The world remembered him, not them. Their names blurred, their faces forgotten, their lives reduced to the final moments of their deaths. Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. Names recited like a litany, yet rarely spoken as stories. They were more than victims. They were women who lived, who loved, who laughed, who sang, who struggled. But history cast them in shadow so the Ripper could shine. That was his second crime, and it was the one the world committed with him. The East End itself carried the burden. Whitechapel became synonymous with fear, a district defined not by its people, but by its killer. Generations grew up in streets haunted by tourists asking where the murders had happened, by books painting their home as a stage for horror. Poverty remained, crime persisted, and always the ghost of the Ripper hung overhead. For the people of Whitechapel, the legend was not thrilling. It was exhausting, a wound reopened each time the name was spoken. And yet, the name was spoken still, whispered in alleys, printed in books, shouted in headlines. Each time the legend grew stronger. Each time the mystery deepened. Jack the Ripper had become immortal, not because he lived, but because he was never caught. The world does not forget mysteries. It clings to them, feeds on them, keeps them alive. And so the Ripper lived on. But what was it that made his story so eternal? Was it the brutality of the murders, more savage than anything the city had seen? Was it the failure of the police, the humiliation of the Empire's finest lawmen, unable to catch a single killer? Was it the letters, mocking in their cruelty, signed with a name that dripped with malice? Or was it the fog itself, the atmosphere of Whitechapel, the gaslight and the shadows, the sense that in those streets anything could happen and no one would ever know? Perhaps it was all of these. Perhaps it was the perfect storm, the perfect crime, if such a thing exists. And in the storm, there was always the question, who was he? Each theory pulled the mask closer, yet each left it just out of reach. Was he Aaron Kosminski, the barber whose madness sent him to an asylum, his mind broken, his silence eternal? Was he Montague Druitt, the barrister who drowned himself, his guilt pulling him into the Thames? Was he a surgeon, skilled with the knife, slipping from the operating theatre into the alleys of Whitechapel? Was he a foreign sailor, vanishing with the tide, carrying London's nightmare across the sea? Or was he no one history had ever suspected, his name lost forever, his face blending into the crowd, each answer terrified? If it was Kosminski, then madness had walked unchecked through the heart of London. If it was Druitt, then despair itself had drowned the truth. If it was a surgeon, then civilization's very healers had harbored death. If it was a stranger, then anyone, anywhere, could carry the knife. And if it was no one, then the terror was eternal. The world would not accept no answer. It demanded truth, even if the truth was myth. And so Jack the Ripper became a canvas onto which each age painted its fears. In the Victorian era, he was the terror of poverty, proof of the rot in the empire's streets. In the 20th century, he was the madman, the lunatic lurking in society's corners. In the 21st, he became the symbol of misogyny, the face of violence against women carved into history. He was all of these because he was none of them. He was whatever the world needed him to be, whatever the world feared most. But while the world argued over his identity, the stones of Whitechapel remembered the women. Their cries still seemed to linger in the fog, their footsteps echoing faintly in the night. Their stories whispered from the bricks of Hanbury Street, from the shadows of Mitre Square, from the silence of Dorset Street. They were the true ghosts of 1888, and they did not vanish with the fog. Jack the Ripper had written himself into legend, but legends, for all their power, are never the whole truth. The truth is messier, crueler, harder to bear. The truth is that 5 women died in agony, and no one was ever punished. The truth is that poverty and desperation drove them into the night, and the night swallowed them whole. The truth is that the city looked upon their deaths with horror, but not with enough compassion to change the streets that birthed them. That is the legacy of Jack the Ripper. Not only the fear he inspired, but the apathy he revealed. And yet, as long as the fog clings to London's alleys, his name will be whispered still. Jack the Ripper, a name without a face, a shadow without an end, a legend that lives not because of what he did, but because of what was never done, because he was never caught, never unmasked, never silenced, and in that silence he endures. The century turned, the empire shifted, wars came and went, and London grew into a city of steel and light. Yet in Whitechapel the fog still clung to the stones, and with it the memory of 1888. Jack the Ripper was no longer just a name. He was a wound that never healed, a question that time refused to answer. The city had buried its dead, but it could not bury its ghost. As the decades passed, the Ripper became a mirror for every generation that peered into the darkness. Scholars pored over the evidence as though decoding scripture, their pens scratching across pages that sought not only to reveal a killer, but to understand the very nature of evil. Each theory carried the promise of closure, yet each only deepened the fog. For every name proposed, another was dismissed. For every revelation, a contradiction. It was as though Jack the Ripper had woven his own immortality into the case, ensuring that no matter how much time passed, the truth would remain just beyond reach. The legend crossed oceans. In America, his name was whispered in the same breath as their own monsters, his shadow stretched across the Atlantic. In Europe, the mystery was retold in new languages, each translation carrying the same chill. Jack the Ripper was not only London's nightmare, he was the world's. The brutality of his crimes, the precision of his vanishing, the taunting letters, all combined into a story too terrible, too irresistible to forget. He had become not just a murderer, but the archetype of the faceless killer. Every shadowy figure, every unsolved crime, bore his reflection. But with legend comes distortion. The true horror of those nights was often lost in the retellings. The stage plays, the novels, the films. They dramatized him, transformed him into a figure cloaked in theatrical menace. His victims became footnotes, their suffering overshadowed by the thrill of his mystery. Audiences gasped at the knife, but rarely mourned the women whose lives had been stolen. The world was fascinated with the predator, but careless with the prey. That imbalance kept the myth alive, but at a cost, the cost of humanity. Still, the streets of Whitechapel remembered. The bricks of Bucks Row remembered Polly Nichols. The backyards of Hanbury Street remembered Annie Chapman. The gateway of Dutfield's Yard remembered Elizabeth Stride. The cold stones of Mitre Square remembered Catherine Eddowes, and the ruined walls of Dorset Street remembered Mary Jane Kelly most of all. Their ghosts did not fade, not in the eyes of those who knew the alleys, not in the hearts of those who listened to the silence too closely. They were still there, shadows among shadows, calling not for spectacle, but for remembrance. In the 20th century, technology promised answers that the 19th had failed to deliver. Fingerprints, blood analysis, forensic psychology, new tools sharpened the hope of solving the oldest puzzle. Yet each attempt fell short. The evidence was too old, too corrupted, too incomplete. The letters that might have held clues were tainted by thousands of hands. The clothing and belongings of victims, preserved poorly, yielded nothing but questions. Even DNA, the miracle science of the modern age, could not break the silence. Samples were degraded, results inconclusive. Each time the world declared the Ripper unmasked, the declaration crumbled like dust in the light. He remained faceless, untouchable, triumphant in his invisibility, and perhaps that was the true terror, that he could be anyone. The butcher slicing meat at the market, the surgeon sharpening his scalpel, the lawyer walking briskly to chambers, the priest, the sailor, the beggar, the aristocrat,